Welcome to another policy video from the Ontario 360 project, housed at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. My name is Sean Spear. I'm a senior fellow at the Munk School and project co-director of Ontario 360. I'm joined as always by my project co-director, Drew Fagan, who's also a professor at the Munk School. And today we have 3 or 4 authors of a new policy brief entitled Attracting and Retaining Capital and Labor in Ontario's Manufacturing Sector. Mike Moffat, John McNally, Anik Islam, and their co-author, Derek Eaton, have contributed this new policy brief that outlines the state of Ontario's manufacturing sector, the case for a policy strategy preferencing the sector, and a series of recommendations to boost output and jobs in the sector. Mike, John, Anik, thank you so much for your contribution to the Ontario 360 project and for joining us today to talk about the policy brief. Guys, I think it's probably worthwhile to start off the conversation at the kind of big picture level. You make the case that it ought to be the goal of the Ontario government to make Ontario's manufacturing sector one of the biggest and best in the world. That runs counter to an argument you hear sometimes in policy circles that we ought to have a policy framework that's neutral with respect to different sectors and subsectors. So can you just start by making the case for why Ontario policy ought to tilt in preference in favor of manufacturing?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to take that one. And I think the biggest argument is around capital mobility, that we, global capital is just that. It's global, and manufacturers can decide whether or not to set up shop in the United States or Canada or Japan or wherever else in a way that some other industries are a little bit more local. So something like if you're mining salt, you have to mine where the resource is. So because there's more international competition for capital, because you do have more capital mobility, that sort of requires you to think through a little bit more about capital. It's just harder. It's harder to tax, and it's harder to create those conditions. And because of that, it also creates more spin-off jobs. So if a city opens an automotive plant, they're going to get a Walmart from that because of the extra economic activity. But if you open up a Walmart, you're not going to get an automotive plant. So just by having manufacturing, by able to attract that capital, that creates higher levels of spin-off activity than other forms of business attraction.
One thing that I'll actually just quickly add to that is that beyond, I think, the case for sort of supporting manufacturing in the context of sort of a big global world, there's also a case for thinking about designing economic policies that benefit, or rather that are directing benefits towards certain sectors. And part of the reason for that is that if we think through sort of the one-size-fits-all economic growth approach, there's going to be the policies are going to benefit certain workers, certain individuals, certain communities over others. So when we think about the benefits to the communities where manufacturers tend to set up, which is often cases, plenty of communities in Southwestern Ontario, lots of communities in Quebec, oftentimes we need to think about how specific policies can impact those communities versus helping white collar workers in Ottawa or Toronto or Montreal in this case. And that's part of where starting to think a bit about what sort the specific policy needs of the manufacturing sector can actually bring up some really interesting ideas and ultimately makes the case for changing the way we think about this a bit.
If I could just pick up that point, John, because I think it's so important, and it's worth probably summarizing and emphasizing for viewers. I mean, I think in effect what you're saying is we need some horizontal policies that cut across the economy, of course, but there's a case for a specialized or customized strategy around manufacturing, in part because of the spin-offs that Mike outlined. In part because of the kind of competitiveness of capital in the sector. But I think, John, the point that you make is really important, that it can also help to enable place-based opportunity in some parts of the province that may not benefit from the kind of growth that we've seen in particular sectors over the past couple of decades. Drew, do you want to pick up that point?
Sure. Well, I think it's an important point, and it's a particular moment after as much as a generation in which manufacturing, was viewed as kind of yesterday's story, and the triumph of the services economy. So maybe put it in that context. And in particular, you have a couple of interesting charts in the paper with regard to manufacturing jobs and the decline that we well remember, I guess, in previous decade, but now the stability and what kind of sectors we're talking about before we, paint this picture and then get to the specific areas in which you focus on, which are skills, capital, and markets.
Yeah, absolutely. So, manufacturing historically in Canada has faced sort of boom bust cycles where, we have periods that we ramp up, like the late 1990s, for example, when the loonie was low and we didn't have as much competition, particularly from China, and employment went up considerably. And the whole sort of post-war period was like that, where we had these sort of ups and downs. Starting in about 2003, we had this combination of enhanced international competition, mostly from China, coupled with a high rising Canadian dollar. So what that created was the conditions I'd call basically like automate or leave. Either firms had to become more productive because they were just going to get crunched on labor costs, or they would move to a Mexico or move to a China or so on. So we had that, and then we had the financial crisis, which wiped out a lot of the lower margin manufacturing industries. So once that was over, we had a decade where basically all the really labor intensive stuff had left and all the sort of lower margin firms had left. So we have a manufacturing sector that is very high skilled, high tech, incredibly productive. And we're seeing output increases every year, but employment has stayed relatively flat. So what we're seeing is mostly generational turnover, as a lot of the manufacturing workers who went into the sector in the 70s and 80s are now retiring and often getting replaced with workers with higher levels of formal education, more technical skills, and so on. So we've seen this upskilling in the sector where, the old days, I grew up in London, Ontario, near Fort Talbotville. And my dad's generation, there were a lot of my dad's friends who dropped out of grade 11 and were able to work at Talbotville. Those days are gone. What we have in automotive and agri-food and other forms of manufacturing in the sector, it's robotic, it's robotics and machinery and very automated processes, not 2,000 guys, and it was mostly guys, 2,000 guys on an assembly line. Those days are largely over.
Right. So that takes us to today, and your points about sort of, a new age of manufacturing. Where does Ontario stand now, if you would? And then you propose a series of initiatives to kind of, as Sean pointed out off the top, to make Ontario really a powerhouse in the new era of manufacturing. Maybe we could start with skills, but where do we stand now?
Well, I think overall, again, we're competing on our own. There's some areas where we're basically able to leverage our existing strengths. Automotive being a prime example, and actually more so on the parts side than the assembly side, though we have had some assembly announcements over the last decade. But we've had big investment in battery manufacturing in Windsor. So we're doing well there. Agri-food is another one, both on processing of vegetables, but also proteins and meats. There are other areas where I think we're struggling a little bit. So we're seeing a lot of investments globally in the semiconductor sector. I know Canada is trying to get there, but we are a little bit behind. So, and that's the thing with the sort of discussion of manufacturing. It covers, a lot of different sort of sub industries, some of which, again, automotive, water purification technology, a bunch of sectors like that. A lot of the sort of clean tech sectors we're doing pretty well in. and then others on, the computer side of things, again, semiconductors and so on. We have some success stories, but we might not be as competitive or have as robust a cluster as some of our competitors. And I think, and that's okay. Obviously we'd like to be number one at everything, but that's probably not realistic. We're probably going to have to figure out, where our big opportunities are and focus on those sectors rather than trying to be, the highest performer in every potential subsector.
Mike, can I just take you up on that point? I know it's a bit of a digression from the paper, but you and the team at SPI have thought so deeply about these questions of sectoral strategies and industrial policy. And one thing that has been top of mind for Drew and me at Ontario 360 is, if in a world policymakers are going to be preferencing certain sectors over others or certain subsectors over others in the name of strategic advantage, or maybe a view that that the sector's output represents something of a kind of critical domestic capacity. Do you have any thoughts in your research? Again, I recognize this is a bit beyond the paper, but I'd be remiss if I didn't put it to this group. Do you have any thoughts on kind of what framework policymakers can use in order to make those judgments, such that they have something of an empirical basis and don't succumb to the kind of political economy tendency to preference sectors or subsectors that may be located in particularly salient ridings or something like that?
So I can actually, Mike, if I can take a first stab at this, and then folks are welcome to add. So we've got I think a couple lines of thinking that we've been doing at SP specifically on this issue. One is in thinking through, again, like you stressed, trying to think more about sort of where placing bets might have a greater opportunity to pay off. And I think as we talked about previously for the manufacturing pitch, the argument becomes that different policies are going to impact different sectors differently. So from a sheer, we want to ensure that communities are sort of well positioned to thrive and succeed in the 21st century. It does make some sense to think about trying to put money in areas where growth is going to occur. But the framework for thinking about that becomes one of thinking less about how do we ensure that this particular industry gets supported in a strategic way, and more so of the place-based approach that I think, Sean, both you and Drew referenced, which is, let's think about what sorts of industries, communities have sort of thrived on in the past. Let's think about what taking those industries and taking all of the amazing resources, assets, knowledge, IP, financial capital that happens to exist, and think about what sort of repurposing some of those cluster approaches looks like for really driving place-based growth. So in this case, it's sort of a reorientation of a framework. Instead of saying, well, let's think about what industrial strategy looks like in the 21st century. It's about, well, what does prosperity for London, Ontario entail? What's London already good at? What does London want to do? And how can we ensure that that community is set up for success, sort of to thrive? And so it becomes less a case of, let's ensure we can predict the best bets, and more a case of, communities can identify the areas where they want to thrive in the future, and we can think about what sorts of policy suites we can best create and position to support that growth in the coming years and decades.
That's really thoughtful, John. We'll have to have you and the team back for another video to dig a bit deeper. But let me turn to you, Anik. One of the ways in which you contributed to the policy brief is on this question of access to capital and the role of tax policy and other provincial policies to ensure that Ontario manufacturers have the capital lifeblood to grow and expand and transform their operations, particularly in a world of net zero emission targets. Do you want to just unpack, the role of public policy to enable sufficient capital in the manufacturing sector going forward?
Sure, thank you. So as you know, manufacturing is a very capital intensive sector, and it is particularly the access to capital for startups and scale-ups is very hard to come by, and they can't access traditional debt markets, loans. If you go to Scotiabank, they won't be able to give you a loan because they don't have the revenue flows to service their debt obligations. So in the absence of that, I think we can use different policy instruments to facilitate that access to capital. In our policy brief here, we propose 3 of them. The first is the corporate income tax cut. So in the federal budget in 2021, the federal government announced a 50% corporate income tax cut for net zero emissions manufacturers. And this ranges from anything to between energy storage, solar, wind, batteries, zero emissions vehicle. And so we think that that can be replicated on Ontario. So Ontario already has a manufacturing and processing tax credit. So if you top up that tax credit with 50% corporate income tax cut, it would make one of the lowest tax rates in North America, and which would attract clean tech firms to set up their shops here, or even like allow startups and scale ups to like set up their operations and achieve commercialization here. The other tax credit that we have proposed here is the investor tax credit. It simply allows businesses and individuals to make equity investments, and you can claim the credit as part of your personal or business income tax, and it helps to attract early stage capital. And currently it has been implemented in a lot of other provinces. BC is one of the clear examples, but this isn't here in Ontario. So Ontario can definitely do this. There have been some evaluation studies on how successful this has been in British Columbia. And so definitely there is a scope for Ontario to do this. The third one is a bit different. So as you know, pension funds are the patient allocators of capital, but the problem with that is they have their set mandates. So for someone like a Canada Pension Plan, their mandate is absolute returns. And for someone like Healthcare Ontario, their mandate is something focusing on the funded status, like having enough assets to like pay out your beneficiary obligations. So we propose like creating a top-down rule where pension like net zero emissions is part of their fiduciary responsibility. So in that way, we can increase access to capital. That change in regulation would put the impetus on Ontario-based pension funds to increase their investment allocation towards renewable energy, clean tech manufacturing, and et cetera.
That's great, Andy. A real masterclass in a set of practical, concrete steps to ensure that there's sufficient capital in the province of Ontario for manufacturing in general, and in particular on the heavy lift that is net zero emissions. Drew, why don't I turn it back to you?
You also focus on skills and the skills gap that exists. I guess not just in this sector, but in many sectors right now, the mismatch. But particularly in this sector, and proposals with regard to how to close that gap over time. There's been a growing focus on that challenge. So maybe we can touch on that.
Yeah, I'd love to. So one of the pieces, I think it's one thing that's really important to sort of stress from the get-go is that the skills gap generally equals labor shortages in practice for companies. It becomes a lot more difficult to hire the folks who have the talent and skill set that you would otherwise need to sort of ensure that you can grow your business. All of that is happening in part on the big backdrop of the trend that Mike mentioned, which is that increasingly the jobs that get created as a result of manufacturing tend to be more specialized, higher tech, higher credentialed in many cases. And so you end up needing a particular candidate who has a set of skills where you're just ultimately drawing from a smaller pool. There's another sort of ongoing trend that the sector's facing, which is as Canada's population ages, there's increased retirements. Now those two trends, along with a few other ones, including housing affordability that I will let Mike speak to, he's Canada's housing guru, but what it sort of means in practice is that we've got a recent study that came out. So we have 8 of 10 companies in Canada in the manufacturing sector are reporting skills shortages, not to grow, but to keep employment at current overall levels, right? We're not talking about like a vision for growth for the sector. We're talking about literally just meeting orders on a day-to-day basis. Now, as we think about whether or not we want the sector to grow and what some of the core sources of growth could be moving forward, and I think in general, we do want the sector to grow. That's a large part of what we're advocating for. Going back and thinking about how to address that skills gap challenge and to remediate these skilled labor shortages, I always come back to this idea of it, again, that place-based approach being a useful one to take. So here, what I think is important is there's three basic questions that we put forward that we need to answer. One, we need to be able to identify the skills, competencies, and qualifications that are going to be in demand both today and in the future to come where shortages are being experienced, right? We need to like concretely identify what workers might not know how to do today so we can ensure that we can design training programs and education programs, practices, policies that aim to plug that gap, specifically to target the areas where the market has identified this as being a gap. The second piece is that we need to better understand how effective existing programs, policies, and practices are at equipping the workforce with the skills and competencies that companies are needing today and will need moving forward. So it's a case of not only identifying some of those skills needs, but identifying whether or not the current makeup of training and education for skills is sufficiently meeting that demand. And if not, what changes need to be made based on international best practices? And here we call for taking a look at things like the US Superclusters Initiative, where there's been a lot of training and education programs that have been developed. There's also a host of programs that exist in Europe, and there's some really interesting stuff that's been happening in a number of different policy communities, notably including a lot that's occurring on like regional economic development and sort of through that perspective to better understand sort of growing industries in this case. And then the final piece before I throw to Mike is, I think we also have to think about within the context of a skilled labor shortage, who is actually able to access these programs. 8 out of 10 companies are reporting worker shortages, right? Which means that it is in the interest of the economy to get everyone who wants to work in one of these jobs access to the education and training that they would like to be able to access it. Which means going back and revisiting, are there factors and mechanisms that are shaping really inequitable access? Are there individuals or members of communities who want some of these jobs but aren't able to access them for specific reasons? Which is that inclusivity lens that we can sort of work in, recognizing that like, there's not only the fairness and justice component, which is incredibly important, there's like an urgent economic need to redress these issues as well. And we really need to think through how to get all of the talent and potential that's currently in Canada who wants to work on solving these problems to work in a productive way. And that means taking a look at those three hard questions that we were otherwise chatting about. The final factor here is obviously unaffordable housing. And for that, I'll throw to Mike to give sort of a bit of an overview about how that might be playing out on the skilled labor side.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the issues that we're having is that, and I did mention that manufacturing is kind of global, but there are, geographic limitations as well. So a lot of manufacturing, for instance, makes sense to have near transport hubs, let's say like Pearson Airport. The problem is nobody can afford to live near Pearson Airport. So we have all of these manufacturing and warehousing jobs that are going either unfilled, or we're asking people to make some very large sacrifices. So one example, when I was in Windsor, Ontario, I was hearing stories of people who live in Windsor who will drive down to jobs in the Pearson Airport region every Sunday night, work those jobs, often live in their car or live in rooming houses, and we've had a big rooming house debate in Toronto, and then drive back on Friday, but they can't make that sort of permanent move. And we see that sort of across the country, where we have this disconnect between where jobs are getting created and housing affordability. So, and ideally, as we've mentioned earlier in this discussion, we do want to have regional economic development to create those jobs in Sarnia or Windsor or wherever else. But we also have to realize that some of those jobs, for whatever reason, are going to get created in more expensive centers. And we need to find ways to increase our labor mobility. So that's a housing play, but it's also a credentials play, and all of those other things that limits, a ambitious person living in New Brunswick from taking a job in Mississauga.
Mike, can I just, again, I apologize for going slightly off of the main focus of the policy brief. But as John said, you've done a lot of deep thinking about the interplay between housing affordability and innovation, housing affordability and economic activity. And one thing that we've been grappling at the Hub is, we've published papers analyzing these housing affordability challenges in the province is fundamentally a supply issue, and the need to reconceptualize provincial and particularly municipal land use policies to enable more housing supply. We've also done some analysis over the years on employment lands, and the need to ensure that we're able to both recapitalize existing plants and build new ones in the name of growing our manufacturing footprint. So, if you were advising a policymaker, how at the provincial, regional, or municipal level, how should they think about but this issue of housing supply on one hand and industrial lands or employment lands on the other hand? Are those objectives in tension in some way? And if so, how do policymakers think about those potential trade-offs?
Yeah, I think there are tensions there, and I think actually one of the places that we're seeing those tensions largest on the ground is actually between manufacturing and warehousing. And I know, talking to policymakers across Southwestern Ontario, they have a real tension there, that they like these warehousing jobs that Amazon and others are creating, but those places take up an awful lot of room that could be used by manufacturers. So I do think it's important at a municipal and regional level to come up with land use planning to make sure that you are maximizing the opportunities there, and sort of getting the most per dollar spent, because there is going to be this tension. But I also, back to the manufacturing and housing piece, I also think there's a real opportunity for us to manufacture houses, or at least parts of houses. There are, I know of a roofing truss company near London, Ontario, that basically, instead of building the roofing trusses on site, you build them in a plant where you can use robots and things like that. So I would love to see provincial governments and the federal governments as well think through that. They realize that, the federal government says that they want to go from 1.8 million homes to 3.5 million homes over the next decade, constructed over the next decade. Well, we're not going to be able to do that with the existing labor pool, and we're not going to be able to build homes the same way we have for the last 60 or 70 years. So can we turn this issue we have in the construction industry and actually use it to increase our productivity and make it more of a manufacturing industry rather than a construction industry? Make it a little less labor intensive.
To be the annoying policy guy about the whole thing as well, I do think it's important to sort of understand the interplay between the regulations and the technology. So what I mean by that is that like prefab or modular housing component construction off-site and then bringing it to site it's a great idea to be able to sort of lower the cost of building each individual unit. You can sort of achieve efficiencies. There's economies of scale there that can definitely be gained. And the construction sector definitely has a productivity growth challenge that I think it's been working to try and navigate for quite some time now. But importantly, the kinds of technology that we deploy are in part a product of the kinds of regulations we have in place about what we're also just allowed to build on particular sites. So I do think it's important to stress that there are absolutely technological solutions that can help solve a host of challenges that the sector is experiencing. But we can't just technology our way out of the problem. There is a need for us to go back and implement some of the tough policy changes to ensure that we can actually use some of the technology solutions in practice, and to ensure that we don't end up needing to work around a self-imposed bottleneck in the form of zoning bylaws or regulations that might limit some of our creativity.
Yeah, absolutely. And particularly on site, it's hard to get insurance to build in new novel ways. So, this goes well beyond the scope of the paper, but I think there's opportunities for the provincial government to do sort of pilot projects on, prefab homes where they say, okay, we're going to try something new, and we'll actually be the insurer on this. We know that the traditional insurance industry doesn't want to touch it. So, we'll do this, and we'll see if this works. So, because a lot of this, again, is we've got regulations that are in place for very good reasons, but oftentimes become out of date over time. Say, okay, can we change some of our building codes, some of the issues around regulation to allow more manufacturing in the housing sector?
Well, we've kept you for a while, and you've even indulged us as have asked some questions that extend beyond the scope of the policy brief, which viewers rather can find at our website, on360.ca. It's entitled "Attracting and Retaining Capital and Labor in Ontario's Manufacturing Sector." Mike, John, and your co-author Derek Thank you so much for your contribution and for joining us for today's conversation.